And each time I reached a village, quickly my presence was reported back to the FSB, formerly known as the KGB. Yeah. So I was sort of tracked until I reached this really crumbling old mining town. Sort of, they used to have 5,000 people, and there was about 500 people sort of scattered amongst the ruins. And as I approached that town, there were a couple of policemen waiting in a jeep just on the outskirts of town. And they asked a bunch of questions, and this wasn't new to me. I have been arrested in Russia actually a few times in the past.
Explorer Charlie Walker took a risk flying in for an expedition through Russia's frozen Far East. When the invasion of Ukraine began, the police soon caught up with him. He wrote all about his fascinating and terrifying experience in the Sunday Times and joins us now. Good morning, Charlie.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on.
Great pleasure. It's a fascinating experience that you've had. Why were you there in the first place? What was your thinking?
I went out there to hike a few hundred miles from a town up in the Arctic and continue from there north up to the Arctic coast with the view to sort of experience the harsh winter in this region of Russia, Yakutia, which is the coldest inhabited place on Earth, and to visit some of the sort of remote indigenous peoples who live in the region. But I, of course, planned all this before things sort of hotted up in Ukraine, and the invasion was 3 days after I arrived.
And how harsh are we talking?
Well, my coldest morning in the tent was minus 48 degrees, so fairly cold.
And what is that, when you have an extravagant experience like that and you talk to someone like me, it's almost impossible for you to convey what that feels like. But I know what cold is. I don't know what crazy cold is. How can you sort of let me in on what it feels like to wake up in a tent at minus 48?
Well, you've got to have a good sleeping bag for starters. But I suppose a good example is while sort of trying to prepare breakfast, still sitting in your sleeping bag, I would have a big, good pair of gloves on. I would start preparing my stove, and I'd be able to use my hands for perhaps 30 seconds before having to then put them between my legs in my sleeping bag, take off both the gloves, rub my hands together until they get warm, put the gloves back on, and then do another 30 seconds or so of preparing breakfast. So everything's just quite sort of tortuously slow, and you have to really be patient and conscientious, because any slips will result in sort of severe frostbite, and you can lose the tips of digits.
Oh God! Now there were some rumblings, obviously, about Ukraine in the days before you left. Did you give any thought to the notion that there could be a full war between the two countries, and that would have an impact on what you're doing? Because what you're doing is so literally remote from the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange looking back at it now, because now it almost seems so obvious. But when I was about to leave, which was in the middle of February, still most of the world, everyone basically except US and UK intelligence, seemed to be saying that this is just a big bluff and it's Putin's method to kind of win some concessions from NATO and get them to sort of back off from his perspective. But I also thought, I'm so far away, geographically where I was starting off my trek is about equidistant between Vancouver and Kiev. So I really felt like I'm so far away, it shouldn't really matter. And once the invasion began, of course, it was horrifying watching it happen, and bizarre being in a city in Russia where people seemed pretty unfazed by it at that point, at least. So I thought, well, I'll get out of town and I'll head off into the remote areas where hopefully it shouldn't be a problem.
And why was it a problem? How did the police catch up with you?
I had no problems with them for the first 3 weeks or so, and I would pass through a village roughly once a week, and these were very small villages, 200-300 people, living. They're accessible in winter via the frozen river that I was trekking along, but in summer they have to wait for the ice to melt, and then the river is navigable. But they really are quite cut off. And each time I reached a village, quickly my presence was reported back to the FSB, formerly known as the KGB. Yeah. So I was sort of tracked until I reached this really crumbling old mining town. Sort of, they used to have 5,000 people, and there was about 500 people sort of scattered amongst the ruins. And as I approached that town, there were a couple of policemen waiting in a jeep just on the outskirts of town. And they asked a bunch of questions, and this wasn't new to me. I have been arrested in Russia actually a few times in the past, but they just made me sign documents saying I would obey the rules of the Russian Federation. And then the next day they found me and issued me with a fine, saying that I'd been conducting journalism while traveling on a tourist visa. So it was an administrative offense, but it came with the sort of caveat that I had been asking provocative questions about Ukraine, which I had spoken to people about Ukraine, because it was almost the first thing anyone asked me, a foreigner, what does he think about this special operation? But I hadn't, the witnesses they produced provided false witness. One guy I hadn't really even met. So it became quite clear that they had, arranged, they had this agenda to find me guilty of that. But after that, I thought it'd be fine. And it was another 3 weeks later when I was finally arrested.
You then spent a month in a centre for temporary detention of foreign citizens. This is about a prison. Is that a prison effectively? Were you in prison effectively?
Yeah. I mean, I was in the cell round the clock. 3 times a week, I was allowed to use my phone for 15 quite strictly timed minutes. But besides that, I was in the cell. Meals were handed through a hatch in the door. There were cameras in the ceiling. It was 2 weeks until I was first allowed outside, and that was just to get into a bus and go to the courthouse and have my appeal rejected while watching in 2 pairs of handcuffs. Another week later, I was for the first time allowed outdoors for 15 minutes just to sort of sit in the sunshine. So it was very much a prison.
And what are your thoughts then? Are you thinking, I might not get out of this?
Yeah, they sort of swung back and forth. The problem is no one really told me what was going on. And when I was tried in court in this little town called Tixi up in the north, there was a translator, an English teacher, but by this point she had been translating between me and the police for about 5 hours and was frankly fed up. And so she sort of stopped thoroughly translating. So I believed I was going to be flown back to the regional capital, Yakutsk, and then be able to book a flight and go home and just leave the country. I knew I was being deported. But when I was put into the detention center, I was told, well, you'll just be here for a few days. And I thought, well, that's fine. But a few days passed, and then I was told I should hire a lawyer. And I was never sure when I was going to leave. And I was constantly worried that I might end up getting retried under a criminal charge they introduced a new law just after the invasion about a week later with a sentence of up to 15 years for quote unquote spreading fake news about the military, and that was aimed at journalists, and they were accusing me of being a journalist. I am not a journalist, I'm a travel writer, and so there was the constant threat of not getting home hanging over me, and I there were times when I thought I could be there for a very long time, and I'm very lucky to not be there now.
And how did you get out?
Eventually they deported me. Because it's so far away and there's no international airport there, you have to be flown to Moscow first, and that involves them booking you a flight and sending you on the flight in handcuffs with guards. So it's a bit of a rigmarole from their perspective, and they don't do this very often, every couple of months maybe. And so very last minute, my partner and my family were able to sort of, with help from the embassy, UK embassy in Moscow, were able to convince them to allow me to go on their latest deportation run via Moscow. If we arranged flights for me, ourselves in a hurry. And the next opportunity would have been late July, I think. So had that all worked out, or had I tested positive for COVID or my pre-flight test or anything like that, then I would still be there.
And just finally, you were talking to people, which is why you got wrongly in trouble. What sentiments were you tracking? Were people at that remove from the centre happy to buy the Moscow narrative?
People's opinions more or less ran the gamut. Most people followed, broadly speaking, the sort of state media narrative of Ukraine being a sort of a rogue Nazi state. But many people in quieter moments, one-on-one, would at least express doubt about some of the things they're hearing. And some people outright thought they were being lied to. I had people, even an official in uniform told me that he was ashamed of his country at this time. I can't say who, I don't want to get anyone in danger. No. So there really was the gamut, but for most people, there's nothing to be gained from standing up and saying what's going on is murderous or aggressive or illegal or whatever, because they just risk their own safety and freedom, and there's no point. So I do understand how most Russian people, whether or not they believe what's happening, are in a difficult position.
Well, listen, Charlie, it's a fascinating, sort of horrifying experience in lots of ways, but it's a great pleasure to speak to you this morning. Thank you for joining us.